The maid screamed. I won't do that again. Sophie froze to the window ledge. The queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there, staring wide-eyed and white-faced at the small girl who was perched on her windowsill in a nightie. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the queen looked petrified too. One would have expected her to look surprised, as you or I would have done had we discovered a small girl sitting on our windowsill first thing in the morning. But the queen didn't look surprised. She looked genuinely frightened. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on the top of her head, was the first to recover. What in the name of heavens do you think you're doing in here? She shouted angrily to Sophie. Sophie looked beseechingly towards the queen for help. The queen was still staring at Sophie. Gaping at her would be more accurate. Her mouth was slightly open. Her eyes were round and white as two saucers, and the whole of that famous, rather lovely face was filled with disbelief. Now listen here, young lady! How on earth do you get into this room? The maid shouted furiously. I don't believe it, the queen was murmuring. I simply don't believe it. I'll take her out of here, ma'am, at once. No, Mary, don't do that! The queen spoke so sharply that the maid was taken quite aback. She turned and stared at the queen. What on earth had come over her? It looked as though she was in a state of shock. Are you all right, ma'am? The maid was saying. When the queen spoke again, it was in a strange, strangled sort of whisper. Tell me, Mary, she said. Tell me, quite truthfully, is there really a little girl sitting on my windowsill? Oh, am I still dreaming? She's sitting out there all right, ma'am, as clear as daylight, but heaven only knows how she got up there. Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming at this time. But that's exactly what I did dream, the queen cried out. I dreamed that as well. I dreamed there would be a little girl sitting on my windowsill, still in her nightie, and she would talk to me. The maid, with her hands clasped across her starch-white bosom, was staring at her mistress with a look of absolute disbelief on her face. The situation was getting beyond her. She was lost. She had not been trained to cope with this kind of madness. Are you real? The queen said to Sophie. Yes, your Majesty, Sophie murmured. What is your name? Sophie, your Majesty. And how did you get up on my windowsill? No, don't answer that. Hang on a moment. I dreamt that part of it too. I dreamt that a giant put you up on there. He did, your Majesty. Ah! The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face. Control yourself, Mary, the queen said sharply. Then to Sophie she said, You're not serious about the giant, are you? Oh, yes, your Majesty. He's out there in the garden now. Is he indeed? The queen said. The sheer absurdity of it all was helping her to regain her composure. So he's in the garden, is he? She said, smiling a little. He's a good giant, your Majesty, Sophie said.